Hey, hey,
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing good, man. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Um, I thought we'd cover the European Middle Ages today.
Perfect. Do you have the requisite weapon?
I do actually. This is a Norman. This is a Norman helmet, and this is a medieval broadsword. Um,
dude, dude, I want to roll up to a party with you wearing that helmet. Oh my god.
California. I'm not sure what they'd. California doesn't like push any laws now. I'd probably be fine doing that there. But yeah, so Middle Age is one of my favorite eras of history, and it's I think one of the most understood eras of history. In that, a rule I have is that the Middle Ages is the opposite. One of the rules I have is that every era of history you think of has the stereotype of what you think of it, and it's also the exact opposite at the same time. And that's very true of the European Middle Ages, in that the things that we believe about the Middle Ages, it was the opposite society in many ways of what the conceptions are. And we'll go through why that happened, why the Middle Ages got so misaligned. But if you go into a history textbook, they will say that the Middle Ages are the period from 500 AD to 1500 AD, or as people like to say, between the first fall of Rome and the second fall of Rome, because the Western Roman Empire fell in 476 and the Eastern Roman Empire fell in 1453. And so for the 1,000 years in between, and you can also say that these things are these things are arguable, or some people say the Middle Ages ended with Columbus. Other people said it started with the conversion of Rome to Christianity, etc. But the in a textbook, it's that 1,000 years. And the period we're going to talk about here is an abbreviated form of that. Because when people talk about the Middle Ages, they're really talking about the High Middle Ages, or roughly from the Crusades in 1100 AD to the Black Death in 1350. And so when we think of medieval civilization, we're really thinking of that. That's the period with castles, with cathedrals, with crusades, with the plague. Because after the Black Death, European society started to move to the Renaissance, it moved to science, that sort of thing. And before 1000 AD, that's going to be the Dark Ages. And so we're going to have a couple adjacent videos where we'll probably do a Dark Age video at some point, which is Fall of Rome to Crusades, then a Renaissance video. And the Crusades and the Hundred Years' War are both topics that deserve their own video, but this is going to be a generalized video on the European High Middle Ages. And the Middle Ages as a term only really makes sense in the European context. And so in the future, we'll make videos about, let's say, medieval Asia. But in Asia, the medieval term, they were existed at the same time, but we use the word Middle Ages because in Europe, it was seen as the period between the fall of Rome and the Renaissance. Um, and do you have any questions before we get started?
No, get into it. Well, I guess one question before we do is
Yeah.
what do people do you think like get wrong about this era, like fail to understand or appreciate?
Yeah, it's so many things. I even have a text wall to remind myself because there's so many. There's a couple different there's a couple different agendas going on with how we write the Middle Ages, and so one of the biggest reason we get it wrong is that we don't want there to be a successful religious society, because if you say that Europe flowered under the Catholic Church, you have to come to terms with both Protestants and atheists don't like the Catholic Church doing successfully, and so they wrote the Middle Ages to be more primitive than they were. And so a lot of things that are really the early modern period. So the early modern period was the time after the European Middle Ages, from 1500 until 1800. And a lot of things that are we say about are the Middle Ages are really the early modern period. In that, for example, the Catholic Church didn't think witches were real before the Black Death. Bathing was really common and socially accepted. Bathing and witches are both early modern things. Um, the Middle Ages wasn't prude about sex. People would have sex in front of each other, and it was common for nobility to have multiple mistresses. You could argue that medieval Europe is a more sexually open society than we are. Um, then, on top of that, the Middle Ages was an incredibly advanced society. It was the most advanced society in history up to its point, except for China. You could argue China at that same era was more advanced, but medieval Europe Medieval Europe invented modern science. The scientific method was invented by monks in the 12 and 1300s. Um, Medieval Europe, they invented the scientific method. They had a stock market, which was pretty advanced. They had universities. They had a banking system. They had pretty advanced understanding of architecture, which you can see with the Gothic cathedrals. And if you think the medieval world was primitive, look at how they were building these giant immense cathedrals in the 1100s, where the medieval European cathedrals were the tallest buildings in the world up to their point. Lincoln Cathedral in England was the tallest building in the world when it was built. Medieval Europe was very advanced in machinery as well, where they were the first people to really use machinery in an advanced way. And the Europeans invented very little in this time period, but they took technologies from Asia and improved on them. And so, for example, the medieval Europeans, they invented the clock. They made mirrors really big. Windmills were very advanced. They had a giant breakthrough in shipping. They had a giant breakthrough in steel, in warfare, in gunpowder. So medieval Europe was the society up to its era of history which had the most technological advance, or the most technological and social advance. And the thing is, our narrative of history is that you have the Greeks and the Romans who are super advanced. The Roman Empire falls, then you have 1,000 years of barbarism and poverty and stupidity, and then the Renaissance happens. And then we go back to civilization, and people start bathing and reading classical literature. And we basically were reading Renaissance propaganda, where the Italian Renaissance was this movement to read the classics of ancient Greek and Roman literature, and then try to revive that old culture. And so they had to make the Middle Ages look bad because they were ashamed of what their grandparents were doing, or their parents. And so we unironically took their narrative. But what happened in the Middle Ages was you saw this advanced society develop, and then what happened was that medieval Europe hit a crisis with the Black Death, and then it transferred into being modern Europe. And the thing that I will give the Middle Ages the best credit for was that it allowed modernity to happen. Most ages of history just stagnate, and there's a golden age and there's a dark age, but medieval Europe was able to adjust enough and establish the framework for modern civilization. And one of the things that I'll try to be careful about in this video is historians have a habit of going native on their favorite era of history, where they start to like it a lot. And I will throw out things about medieval Europe that are negative, just as a way to counterbalance that. But I think this is one of you guys already know a lot of what the negative stereotypes are from the Middle Ages. So I'm speaking more about the positive to give more of a countervening picture.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Huh. There are a couple weird facts about the Middle Ages, just as their worldview, before we move on to the history. Where one of the most interesting books I've read is The History of Manners by Norbert Elias, and it's a history of how manners people relate to the world. And medieval senses of manners were insane. Like, people would write poetry at how much they enjoyed killing other people. Or, as I said, people would have sex in front of each other. Or, like, entire towns would go naked to baths. And you would cut open an animal's carcass and then cook it in front of your entire house. So this is a society which is much more animalistic and much more primal than our current society. And the process of gradually increasing, as society grows, you have to increase disgust sensitivity. And so in the Middle Ages, people were living inside their own little communities. You could have that degree of disgustingness. But once you live in a city, you don't want to see this random guy. You don't want to see that. And so as civilization grows in scale, you have to mitigate for disgust sensitivity more. So that's the first interesting fact of the Middle Ages. The second interesting fact is it's a much more intellectual society than we give it credit for, where medieval Europe was more inventive philosophically than the Romans were, which is something people don't, it just blows a lot of their minds. But in the mid 1300s, the universities of Italy were taken over by atheists, which is something you think, oh my God, the Catholic Church totally ran this society. But no, you had philosophic atheists in the Middle Ages. It was a lot harder to be an atheist, which leads to the third point. In that medieval Europe was a society where it was difficult to be an atheist because they viewed the world as a magical place. And medieval Europe is more like the rest of history, and we're special in that the medieval worldview. And there's a really interesting book called A Secular Age by Charles Taylor, where they had this idea that psychology was collective. And so let's say, for example, you have to protect your society against demonic plague. And the role of the church is to protect society against demonic plague. And they also thought that stuff like astrology or the seasons affected people's emotions. And so their entire theory of the world in psychology was that the human mind is permeable like a germ, and so you have to protect it. And our society has a very different perspective where we have the buffered personality, which is the idea that every individual is rational. So if you want to change someone's mind, you have them rationally think through their choices in therapy. And the medieval worldview, the reason the Catholic Church would kill heretics is they saw the heretics, and heretics are people who disagreed with the Catholic Church's doctrines. They saw heretics as germs to the collective psychology of the society. And so they saw people who disagree with the church as you are a pathogen who will destroy the souls of the people in society. That's a very different worldview from what we have today. And you good before I just move into the actual history of the Middle Ages?
Yeah, feel free. I want to make sure we have time for it.
Yeah. So the period we're starting with the High Middle Ages. Whoa, man, we're in the High Middle Ages, man. There were knights and stuff. Yeah, so this period starts around 1000 AD, and I just finished reading a book on this topic by Reynolds. It's called Europe Emerges. I've read a lot in the Middle Ages, but it started out with that time period where Western civilization, in that time period, it was just western half of Germany, Italy, the northern tip of Spain, France, and Britain. And what happened there is the Vikings were attacking down from Scandinavia, the Arabs were attacking from Spain and North Africa, and the Hungarians were attacking from the east. And around the 10th century, it was the lowest point that Western civilization was ever at. Every part of the West was being attacked by these invaders. And there's a great book by, I think, Collins. It's something like, I forget the name of this book. It's Collins. It's a history of the 10th century. I'll pull it up. This book is good. Tom Holland's also got a book on this topic. It's something like The Start of Europe by Collins. So that in that period, feudalism formed. And it's ironic, we'll cover feudalism partially in the Viking Fall of Rome and medieval videos, but feudalism is a social structure in which you have a town. Imagine you bring in private security to protect the town, and then the private security turns itself into the ruling class of the town. And feudalism started in the area around the north of France to fight off the Vikings, but then it spread around, and feudalism wasn't as oppressive a social structure as we imagined it in the beginning, because do you know what serfdom is?
this idea that they're like, I guess, what's the difference between serfdom and slavery?
So serfdom is a concept where they're not really slaves. Imagine it where you have a renter, and the renter has to pay, like, let's say, a certain amount of their income to their landlord, where the landlord under feudalism provides the landlord provides the government, the rent, the housing, the legal system. And so you'll hear about like feudal peasants giving, it got pretty ridiculous by the time the Middle Ages fell apart, like two-thirds of their income to their lord. And keep in mind, that's equivalent to a person today paying their landlord and taxes. And
And did they have other options? It's not slavery because they weren't forced to do it, but did they have other
no, they
options?
are forced to do it. So what
Oh,
happens is that, yeah, it's not a, like, I'm not going to defend, I will partly defend feudalism, but
but
it's not a
why
great
is it, why is it better? Why is it different? Why are they
no,
not slaves if you're forced to do it?
reasons. The serfs have property rights. And so the serfs aren't property of their lord. The serfs have strict legal rights where the lord can only make them. Feudalism got more oppressive, where in the beginning it wasn't that constrictive, where it's like you have a landlord, but you're not allowed to leave. And so you're
Yeah.
stuck on your landlord's land. And it got worse as population density got worse. And so with if you're a serf, you pay your landlord, he protects you, you're not allowed to leave. Your landlord doesn't really have that many other cruxes over you. He makes you work, like, let's say 1 or 2 days a week for him, um, and he's not allowed to sell you. There was a principle that in parts of Europe that became a huge sticking point, that the lord wasn't allowed, could keep peasants from getting married if he didn't want to, and that became a huge legal struggle. And the reason the lords didn't turn the peasants into slaves is that the Catholic Church protected them. And the thing that, in my opinion, made the Western civilization so successful was the Western civilization had a separation of authority. And so you had the church fighting against the nobility, you had the merchant class who started out as pirates, you had the centralized king, and all of these people were competing with each other. And medieval Europe was actually not an authoritarian country, or not an authoritarian society, in that we imagine these kings having total power. But the reality is that every king in Europe had a parliament. And parliaments were pretty powerful in the Middle Ages because the nobility controlled the parliaments. And what and so Europe was an incredibly decentralized society because these feudal lords would build castles, and it was really hard to take the castles. And so, for example, France started out as a failed state. In that, it's weird to talk about France being a failed state, but France spiraled off into these lordlings like Anjou, Normandy, Aquitaine. The king of France himself controlled just the city of Paris. Um, and and so what happened is that even in the unified countries like England or Germany, England was unified for this entire period. England was the only country in Europe that could maintain unity over the Middle Ages. Germany was unified for the first half of this period, then fell apart. Even in Germany, the king barely had any power over his own lords. And so if you look at like national tax rates, they were incredibly low in the Middle Ages because the king couldn't raise taxes from his own people, because if the king did anything, the nobility would just try to kill him. And it's weird to read medieval records where the king says, I will raise taxes 0.6%, and the nobility starts a 15-year war. And so these kings basically had very little power, and they had to compete with all these special interests. And kings gradually consolidated power over the time of the Middle Ages. And the way feudalism worked was the king would give land. Let's say you're the king of France. You give land to the Duke of Aquitaine. He, in turn, gives land to his counts. And it's this pyramidal, it's like a Ponzi scheme. And it gradually spread out. And it was most monarchies in medieval Europe failed at some point. And there's this whole school of libertarian anarchism I don't want to get into, which wants to go back to that as a society. And so Northern France, feudalism starts. And feudalism became this very successful social model through creating knights. And the medieval system largely gifted to create knights. And knights were guys on horseback who were trained ever since childhood to fight. And the knights on horseback gave Europe a military advantage over its enemies, where in our future episode in the Crusades, you see that Crusaders were able to take on vastly outnumbered armies because they had knights, because the cavalry charge of these guys on horses with 1,000 pounds of armor just smashing into their enemies. And the reason the nobility were in charge was that the technology of that time period meant that a small group of knights could kill a large group of peasants. And so that allowed class oppression in medieval Europe. And the reason that we stopped having the nobility was we invented gunpowder. And gunpowder is an equalizer, since anyone can shoot the gun. But for the knights, if you were a knight, you started training at age 7, and then by the time you're 21, you have trained for 15 years. And because the technology of war was so expensive, that you trained a caste to fight in armor on these expensive horses, because the armor itself and the warfare was so expensive that what mattered was increasing the skill of the person using the armor. And so that's also why medieval Europe had this heroic tradition of why they valorized manliness and toughness and these very martial warrior traits. In Europe in this time period was a warrior society. It was very aggressive. And through the spread of feudalism and knights, and the Normans from the north of France, they conquered England and they colonized it. And England didn't used to be like this, but then it became a feudal colony, basically, of French speakers. It spread to Scotland and parts of Scotland and Ireland through that. Germany adopted this social structure. And one of the weird aspects of European history that we don't remember is there was a very significant amount of colonialism during the High Middle Ages. So this area that started out with just the core of Western Europe, the Christians pushed the Muslims down to the bottom of Spain. And so around the year 1220, the Christians had reconquered nearly all of Spain, and they were in the process of colonizing it from the local Muslims. And around 1000 AD was the point where all of the Asian civilizations slowed down their development and Europe sped up. Where the year Europe really started to do a lot better was 1000 AD. And so Poland, Hungary, the Vikings all converted to Christianity, and they became part of this broader medieval system. And so starting around 1100 AD, you see this rise of this new, much larger, stronger civilization. And past that point, Europe was able to get the skills from being attacked on all sides, so that it started to go on the offensive. And so you started to see this European civilization fight the Muslims and go on the Crusades, which we'll talk about later. They killed the Eastern Byzantine Empire. There were crusades against the pagan peoples of Eastern Europe. And so Europe was this dynamic, growing society, and there were several breakthroughs in the 11th century, where one of which was the discovery of a new plow. And this plow turned Northern Europe from really difficult to farm to the wealthiest farmland in the western half of Eurasia, where Europe, imagine if we discovered new technology that made the Canadian Arctic suddenly super valuable. That's the equivalent of what happened, where suddenly it used to be that France and Egypt had the same population of like 5 million people. Due to this invention in plow technology, France suddenly ended up with 3 times Egypt's population. And so when you look at medieval Europe, you're seeing this era of profound growth and colonization. And as Aristotle said, every process, when pushed to its final logic, will be what destroys it. And so Europe at the start of this period was all forests. And when you read out fantasy novels are set in a culture that's like the start of this time period, with the transfer from the Dark Ages to the European Middle Ages. And this is when the European epic stories took place, like King Arthur, when they were written, like King Arthur, the Charlemagne sagas, Siegfried. These are the kinds of things that Lord of the Rings is based off. And so the Europeans were colonizing and cutting down the forests. And in Europe over this time period, in large part due to taking technology and learning from the Greeks and the Byzantine Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire and the Muslims, Europe across this time period saw a revolution in learning and in technology. We talked about technology already, and Europe went from the least advanced of the big four Eurasia. Europe was vastly less advanced than Asia in the year 1000 AD. But by 1250 to 1300, Europe had surpassed all the Asian civilizations. And this was something the Asians didn't realize. They viewed the Europeans with contempt until the point when the Europeans conquered them. And it's weird to read Muslim historians who were otherwise very intelligent in the mid 14th century called the Europeans total barbarians. Well, the Europeans were more advanced and populous in almost every way. And the Europeans were also very curious about other societies. And that's one of the most positive traits of European culture, is that the other civilizations weren't really willing to learn, but the Europeans took all this technology and ideas from Asia and then reincorporated it. And again, the best thing that happened in medieval Europe was the competition of authority, where the church, the king, the nobility, and the merchants all competed against each other. And then the peasants started fighting later on. And so that meant they could all hold each other accountable. And medieval Europe saw the establishment of almost all the institutions that resulted in the modern West. For example, individualism stems from the Catholic Church breaking up the clan structure. The concept of freedom stemmed from the Middle Ages. The universities were invented in the Middle Ages. Capitalism stemmed from the Middle Ages, in which Europe was so decentralized and the government was so weak that the merchants, no one could stop them from growing. And so Europe in this time period is one of the few eras of history in which capitalism was superior to the actual government. For most of history, your lord tells you to work, you work. But in this time period, government was so weak that capitalism meant that your lord couldn't. It weakens the power of authoritarian power. And Europe's pirates, unlike the rest of the world, Europe's merchants, unlike the rest of the world, started out as pirates and Vikings. And so the way capitalism started was these Viking warlords would raid somewhere. And then once it got too hard to raid, they would change to being merchants, but they were still heavily armed. And in most of the rest of the world's civilizations, what happens is that the nobility and the king sign up and work with the mob to attack the capitalists, where the government will say, hey mob, hey people who are poorer, you don't like the rich, let's work together to take their money. And that didn't happen in Europe due to the decentralization of power. And as I said before, the scientific method stems from all of a very significant amount of the logical tools we use stem from the Middle Ages. And you have records from 1200. People were already thinking about steamships, helicopters, and tanks as early as the 1200s. And that shows that we are, in a lot of ways, the same civilization as the Middle Ages. Same language, same religion, same legal code, same social structures, same parliamentary structures, etc. Any questions before I continue?
Well, I just want to harp on it's amazing how much we've taken from, you would think that things would be radically different in across the board, but it's fascinating to.
Yeah, there's no credit for it, and it's crazy how normal people don't realize any of this.
Yeah.
So one of the books, as we do the series more and more, there's a handful of sources I keep on coming back to, and not all historians are created equal. And in very, very many of the videos we cover, Rise of the West by McNeill is the best source. And he hits at a lot of these points, and he puts a lot of emphasis in the European Middle Ages, which is why I got on said topic. But yet, he has a really good split of European politics in this time period, where Western Europe was the struggle between England and France. Central Europe was the struggle between the Pope and the Emperor, and Eastern Europe between the king and the nobility. And so I'm going to go through each of those. And these will probably deserve some of at least England and France are going to get their own video. But the incestuous relationship between England and France is that in this time period, there's the King of France. The King of France was useless in the beginning. There's the Duke of Normandy. The Duke of Normandy was supposedly beneath the King of France, but he was actually more powerful. The Duke of Normandy conquered England. England is a separate monarchy. And so you end up with this just shows how weird and incestuous feudal politics get, where the King of England was his own king, except for his lands in France, where the King of France, who was weaker than him but above him in authority, was his king for. It doesn't have to make sense. It didn't. It caused 200 years of wars. It's weird. But what ended up happening was that the French ended up getting their best leader at the same time the English got their worst leader, where King John of England, actually the Magna Carta and the legal rights that we in the English-speaking world have stem from King John being such a jackass that all the nobility teamed up to write a list of rules he wasn't allowed to break, that being the Magna Carta. At that point, the English had gotten half of France. And what happened when King John was being an idiot is that Philip Augustus, King John's probably the worst king in English history, and there are revisionist historians who disagree, but I don't agree with what they're saying. Revisionist historians will say anything. Like 80% of revisionist history is garbage. That being said, Philip Augustus is one of the best rulers in world history, in my opinion. And when Philip Augustus started, the King of France controlled an area of modern France the size of New Jersey. And then in his one lifetime, he conquered as much as the size of Texas, basically. And so Philip Augustus was France's greatest leader, barring Napoleon. And he drove the English out of most of France. And he also used a crusade to crush the south of France. So he started out with an area the size of New Jersey and took France from sea to shining sea. Bless you. And so that got the English and the French stuck in a bunch of wars. And again, 100 Years' War is a different video. But what inevitably happened was that England had a quarter of France's population. England was it was a small country, but England was much better organized and much more centralized. So ironically, the King of England had a similar budget to the King of France, and he could pull troops more easily. And so France was such a big and diverse country back then, where there were dozens of dialects of French who weren't intelligible, is that the King of England was constantly trying to get inside internal squabbles in France to split the French apart. And so after centuries where the English nearly conquered France a few times, the French were finally able to drive the English out. So that's the Western theater. And the English and the French also, they got involved in Spanish politics, where the Spanish for this whole time period were trying to drive the Muslims out of the country. And that's called the Reconquista. In Central Europe, it was the emperor versus the Pope, where, again, medieval politics are so incestuous, but the Pope appointed, the Holy Roman Emperor was the emperor of the Germans, and he had Germany and Italy at a later point. And so the Holy Roman Emperor had this giant area of Central Europe, but he could barely govern it. It was so huge and so many nobility. And the Pope had appointed the Holy Roman Emperor centuries before, and they were stuck in this weird legal issue, again, feudal politics, between was the Pope superior to the Emperor, because the Emperor helped establish the Pope and then the Pope helped establish the Emperor. And keep in mind that a quarter to 40% of France's and Germany's land was run by the church. And it's hard to overestimate how important the church was to medieval philosophy and the medieval world, because every single aspect of their lives was dominated by the church. And because of that, the Pope, who controlled this tiny area of central Italy around Rome, the Pope was able to have outsized political power because all of the subjects of Europe were people who loved the Pope. And so the Pope was constantly able to work with local nobilities against the emperor. And so you saw this political struggle between the German emperor and the Pope, and it's really, really complicated. There were many phases where both sides tried to win. But what you guys need to know is that the The Pope finally won, which is a weird result because if you compare them on the map, the German emperor had like 50 times as much land. And the Pope did so by working with the local German nobilities to split Germany into civil war. And this is one of the big turning points in history that people forget. But Germany was the biggest empire in the early Middle Ages, and that just fell apart. And Germany became this squabbling group of hundreds of city states. And you really wonder, what if Germany had remained that huge centralized empire? Because they would have easily been the most powerful state in Europe, but they fell apart due to a crisis of leadership. And Italy also spiraled into intractable civil wars between the supporters of the emperor and the supporters of the pope. And that war in Italy, called the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, that went on for 100 years after the emperor had lost. It's just ridiculous. Um, and and so a big thread, and we're covering a long time period, so I can't tease out all the threads fully, is that the Pope was trying to establish himself as a king and to dominate all of Europe. This is a weird medieval thread, and it leads to the next point really well, in which the Pope was trying to establish authority over Europe, over the kings, because medieval Europe always had this tension between church and state, where you had a church legal code, you had a state legal code, you had lands run by the church, you had lands where they weren't. And the Pope's goal was to make all of the kings basically follow him. And around 1000 AD, the Catholic Church during the Dark Ages siphoned off all the smartest people. So the people who would be in tech or finance or politics today were working for the church. So the church had a couple absolutely brilliant leaders, and there was this religious revolution in the 11th century where the church really got its act together and it became a lot more moral. And then the church tried to use this for political power. And then this leads to the decline of the Middle Ages, in that as the church became more powerful, it became apparent that the church was morally corrupt. And it's one of those catch-22s you see over history, that the more power you get, the more you get corrupted and the less people like you. And so as you look over the course of the Middle Ages, you see the church was just acting in a completely self-interested way. They were launching excommunications and crusades against political enemies. They were making very politically motivated decisions. And so, ironically, through beating the Holy Roman Emperor, the Pope and the papacy became completely degenerate and lost any respect. And so the Pope, after beating the Germans, tried to go for the French, and the French king literally just killed the Pope. It's hard to imagine that was an option, but he just did it. And then he appointed a new French Pope, and the rest of Europe was like, what the hell? You just can't appoint a French Pope. And so there was a struggle between 2 and 3 popes. We were each claiming to be the Pope. And it spiraled off into anarchy, and this really lost a lot of the respect for the church, which inevitably resulted in the Protestant Reformation afterwards. And for the third axis, which is Eastern Europe, you saw the struggle between the nobility and the king. And Eastern Europe was a lot more primitive than Western Europe. And Eastern Europe was ironically a freer society. And so because these Eastern European kingdoms like Russia or Poland or Hungary were relatively weak, they were constantly struggling against these nobilities. And so Poland spiraled into civil war a couple times, and it split up. Again, every country in medieval Europe splits up. Hungary had a similar issue. Hungary also had its own version of the Magna Carta. But what occurred by the end of the Middle Ages? So Western Europe, France beats England. Central Europe, the Pope beats the Emperor but loses. Eastern Europe is that the nobility won out in Hungary and in Poland, and the monarchy won out in Russia. And so that resulted in Russia winning because it had a stronger centralized government, although it was a very unfree and autocratic society, while Poland and Hungary, which in my opinion had tremendous potential to be great nations, basically wasted it because the nobility became so powerful. And even though during the Middle Ages, the nobility didn't have that much, the peasants were free in Eastern Europe. But then Afterwards, they installed serfdom. At the end of the Middle Ages, Western and Eastern Europe went in very different directions, where Western Europe became a free society and Eastern Europe became a serf society. And Eastern European serfdom was much more comparable to American slavery than to Western European serfdom. And that's a huge reason why Eastern Europe is vastly poorer than Western Europe. But to lead back to all these threads, to pull it back together, the medieval order, by the time you get to the 14th century, was becoming completely unsustainable, where these various institutions worked relatively well in the 11th and the 12th centuries, but each of the medieval institutions became morally corrupt. An example was feudalism and serfdom, where for the 11th and 12th centuries, it was relatively easy to enter the nobility. And it was different by what European country you were in. But if you owned land or could outfit a horse, or the king liked you could become a noble. As you get to the 14th century, it had completely crystallized into social castes. And the nobility, Europe was hitting a crisis very similar to what we have today in the 14th century, where there was mass inequality, religious fanaticism, political partisanship, overpopulation, too much competing for positions, people competing for a few good jobs that weren't there, all the issues we've spoken about before. And so Europe was in a really bad place, and people literally thought the end of the world would happen. And there was this flood around the North Sea, which literally killed 500,000 people due to famines. And that's just a sign of how precarious Europe was. And so the class structure became entrenched. And the nobility, who were themselves broke, were trying to oppress the peasantry so much. So the peasants were starving. So the peasants rebelled against the nobility. And so you had all of these peasant revolts across Western Europe, which were inevitably crushed, but they did result through eventually the peasants getting freedom. And the church became corrupt, as we said before. The academia, it stopped having the ability to think creatively. And so it became stuck in this mental prison of scholasticism. And scholasticism is this idea you have to study what Aristotle or Plato said, and the outside world isn't as good as Aristotle or Plato. So just read them, don't look at the outside world. And then Europe was able to break out of that to get science. And the capitalism of that era was completely stultified, in that medieval capitalism was run by guilds, or these associations of people who worked together, who would manage the quality of it. They'd manage the wages they get. So you'd have a guild for carpenters, you'd have a guild for shipwrights, you'd have a guild for any single profession you'd imagine. And the guilds used to be open, but by the time you get to the 14th century, there were these very closed hereditary castes. And you had trading organizations like the Hanseatic League, where in the north of Germany, you had these alliance of towns who pushed each other's trading influences. And in this time period, the wealthiest places in Europe were Belgium, the north of France, and the south of England, and then northern Italy. North Italy was by far the wealthiest place in the world. And we'll have to cover that more in a Renaissance podcast. But in Europe of this time period, it became incredibly stultified, and medieval civilization was just stuck. It couldn't move forward. Every single social institution was rigid. And then the Black Death happened. The Black Death is where I consider to be the end of the European High Middle Ages. And with it, it was this disease coming out of originally the southwest of China. And there was the Mongol Empire, which controlled everything from Romania to Korea. And the Mongols were fighting a war in the south of China. And then they encountered this species of gophers. Black Death comes from rodents and gophers. And then it spread across the Mongol Empire. And then they were besieging an Italian colony in Crimea. The Italians had a giant colonial empire in the Middle Ages, and they would shoot bodies into the Italian town. And then the Italians fleeing brought the plague back to Italy. And Europe at this point was overpopulated. People were living in their own shit. They didn't have the concept of germ theory. And then half of Europe died. I don't know the transition for that. Half of Europe died. People would go to bed and then wake up dead the next morning. People saw entire villages dead. It was worse in some areas. In France, 2/3 of the population died. And if I'm being honest, the Black Death was possibly one of the best things that ever happened to Europe. Because what happened when you have this overpopulated, rigid society, half the population dies, the value of labor is suddenly much higher. And so the quality of life went from unbearable to pretty good. And it also resulted in the creation of capitalism, because you saw the early versions of capitalism in the Middle Ages, but they got stultified. Black Death happens, and you suddenly can't keep your people as serfs anymore. And because you, as a lord, can't you keep your people as serfs, because they'll just move to another lord who doesn't. And so serfdom ended because of that. And the combination of the increases in price, in the value of prices, in the value of labor, and the peasant rebellions meant that the European monarchies had to give up on their previous rigid social structure until you saw modern capitalism emerge in a more fluid social structure. And across this whole time period, the nobility was getting less power versus the merchant capitalist class. And it's ironic that across the world, when you establish feudalism, it will normally result in creating capitalism. And there was this whole archetype over the Middle Ages of the nobleman who is completely in debt to the capitalist. And you start going to the early modern period, and the 14th century, the Black Death, it was not a fun period in European history. It was wars everywhere, the Black Death killing half the population. It was a really cold period in the mini ice age. But out of it, the Europeans were able to establish a new social order in which it allowed all the great things that came out of modernity. Where out of the fall of the medieval social order came modern science, it came the age of exploration, the Reformation, the Renaissance, all of those things. And the best thing I can say about medieval Europe is that medieval Europe established something better to come afterwards. Because I often judge history. What legacy did you leave the world? And there are very profound eras of history that don't leave good legacies. But if you look at all the Asian civilizations, they crystallized after the Black Death. In Islam, India, China, the Black Death resulted in them becoming much more conservative and rigid. And in Europe, there was the opposite. And so that's and I think it's due to a combination of the flexible European political and social structure, where there's constant competition between social classes, and also the Catholic Church creating this concept of scientific truth. Because the Catholic Church made this is one of the most important things in history that no one's heard of. But in the 13th century, the Catholic Church determined the principle that God made the outside world. And so by studying the outside world empirically, you will discover God's truth. And this resulted in the creation of science. And for example, in Islam at the same time, Islam used to be scientific, but then they made the decision, since God makes the world, thus we should read the Quran to understand God, because God can change the world at any time. And so this was a real breaking point where Islam or Christianity could have gone to the other place's position, but the Christians took the right turn and the Muslims took the wrong turn.
Say more about what would have looked like if they'd taken a different turn, or like what sort of alternative history you can imagine here?
We'd be Islam. The Western world would be it's crazy where Islam is still a medieval society, where in the Arab world, there's no one who can make a bicycle. And Islam stopped where you saw the installation of a rigid, because Islam was actually capitalist before it turned its hard turn, where Islam became run by a rigid social class with the nobility and the church allied. Islam didn't have any of the scientific or geographic revolutions that Europe had, and Islam just stagnated under this theocracy. And that was all because imagine the Pope wins. The Pope would establish a kind of European society like that. And the thing is, the West is the bizarre exception in that in that in that all the other great civilizations, this is what happened to them. The West was the only society that was capable of criticizing itself and then changing in a positive way.
That makes sense. The is like, in order for the world to have been Islam, like, do you think that's an actual alternative that could have, or like, was it built into the structure?
Yeah, I think I've actually made a timeline about that. It's what if the I made this sound like 4 years ago. What if the West went the way of Islam? And I mean, we could make the next video at the Islamic Golden Age. That would exactly tailor into what you just asked. And yeah, a couple more threads. The medieval world ended. A big factor here is the discovery of the pike and gunpowder, because the military advantage the knights had, it was based upon the ability of the knights themselves to fight. And so as the middle classes grew stronger, the middle classes grew the ability to fight themselves. And so in medieval warfare, peasants couldn't fight. And there was this concept in medieval life and philosophy that the higher your social class was, the more you had to fight. And so if you were of a certain class, social class, you often literally had to keep your sword on your side in public at all times. There were rules in the Middle Ages that you had to always have your sword. And among that's even true in the middle class, but no one expected the lower classes to fight, because the concept in the medieval world was your degree of stake in society determines how much you have to fight. And we kind of have the opposite image, where we tell the poor to fight the most. And then if you're rich, you can constantly escape war. But as the middle class, because the end of the Middle Ages is fundamentally the victory of the middle class and the capitalist class. The middle classes started to fight, and with that came the longbowmen and the pikes. And so over the late Middle Ages, you saw the knights losing out as these guys with spears. And the guys with the spears could beat the cavalry because they were middle class people, or they were they were free farmers who were capable of fighting the knights because they had the willpower to stand together. And England was one of the few countries with a strong middle class. So the English could recruit their longbowmen archers, who were archers who could kill knights, which was insane. Well, France couldn't make longbowmen because France didn't have a comparable middle class. Because in France, you were scared to arm the lower classes because they revolt. And over the course of the Middle Ages, I think this is a really important symbolism, is that the knights stopped fighting. By the time you get to 1500, it's all gunpowder and it's spears. And so the nobility became these docile house pets who would hang around the capital and who would party with the king. I'm not making this up. It was actually a political strategy to make the nobility party with you all the time, because through partying with you all the time, you could always keep your eye on them, and they were spending so much money partying with you, so they couldn't build their own armies. Louis XIV maxing. So with the end of the nobility and with gunpowder and the big cannons, you could knock in the nobility's castles. And so you saw the centralization of power and the rise of the modern world. Because, for example, when France could knock in the nobility's castles, the Duchy of Berry the County of Berry, real place, couldn't maintain its independence. And so you saw all these factors resulting in the modern world, whether capitalism, centralized governments, science, the age of discovery, come with the ending of the Middle Ages. And I have one final point. Do you have any questions before I make my final point?
There, get to the final point.
So the thing with the medieval worldview, because I have really been gassing up the Middle Ages, because it's my favorite era, and also it's an era that's been maligned by the rest of history. But the big flaw of the medieval worldview is the opposite of ours, and that our world, we have a lot of data, but we can't explain it. There's infinite amounts of the internet, infinite amounts of information, but no one knows what to do with it, which is why we believe in saying stuff. Middle Ages is the opposite. The Middle Ages overdetermines categories. And so in our society, we pretend to not have social class, but then we really do. In the Middle Ages, you are hyper prescriptive of what social class someone is and what duties they have. And ironically, the nobility themselves, their grandparents weren't nobility in a lot of cases, but then they'd make up an aristocratic heritage for them. Or there were a lot of peasants who were wealthier than the nobility. So there were significant modernity as a rule, and the industrial world as a rule, have more social mobility than the Middle Ages. That being said, there are significant parts of the Middle Ages that have more social mobility than today, because we are now at the era of the least social mobility for the industrial world. And so the Middle Ages, even though their social structure is much messier than it actually is, they create this abstract concept of what class is. And it's especially true in medieval philosophy, where you can tell the medievals, they'll operate off the most ridiculous evidence. They'll say, my cousin told me that there are apes that walk upon their legs and run a society in the Indian Ocean. Do you want to guess what that's a reference to?
What is that? I have no idea.
Lemurs. Apes that walk around have a society in the Indian Ocean. That's lemurs. Or they have the wool lamb of Tartary. There's a plant that makes wool, and the tree, the sheep live in this plant. That's cotton. And there's this place called the Sargasso Sea in the middle of the Atlantic, where the Sargasso Sea is it's this area where there's a lot of grass in the middle of the Atlantic. The Middle Ages turned that into, this is a place where the grass will trap your ship, and sea serpents will eat the men. And so our society often is we're too empirical to the point where we're very gullible, and we don't want to make generalizations. The medieval world was way too fast to make generalizations and just make stuff up. And so they were hyper specific. They were way too quick to make stuff up. And medieval society, they viewed everything as an ecosystem where each social class was like part of a jungle. And so what that ended up with was basically rent seeking by certain. So it created what I think is a pretty organic social structure. But at the same time, it resulted in the people higher up in the structure oppressing the people beneath it. Well, our society is we view everyone as an interchangeable cog. And so we allow greater movement, but at the same time, it's a lot more sterile and depersonalizing. Yeah.
Huh. Yeah, that's really interesting. Hard to imagine we have less social mobility today than in the past in some ways, but
yeah, we're relatively it was better in our parents' lifetime. Like the boomers had some of the highest social mobility, but it's crashed precipitously over the 21st century. And so we're the period in American history with the least social mobility now, and it's mostly due to the college system, because once you put college in, it resulted in basically competition. We're going to get upper class kids into college, and then it's going to be selected from there. And in a pre-college system, it's just like, young Billy is a hard worker, I'm going to promote him in the company. Where my dad's got this board game from 100 years ago where it's you start working in a company where at the paper boy, then you work your way up to be CEO. And that's completely unimaginable today.
Right. So basically, you measure when you say there's less social mobility, you mean if you start poor, there's less chance for you to become one of the ones.
And I don't want to wear total rose tinted glasses for the Middle Ages, in which the period that's comparable to us, the 14th century, medieval Europe at its worst point had significantly lower social mobility than we do today, and it was a much more oppressive social class structure at its worst too.
But you'd still want to be a poor person today than a poor person back then.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I'd way prefer to be I mean, so the calculation you're making is, am I going to be poor with religion and community, or am I going to be poor with infinite food and TV and porn? definitely the latter. Yeah. Also, the removal of disease is so cool. Like not having to worry. In the Middle Ages, half the population died before age 15.
Yeah.
Because you see these things, like the average age of death was 20 years old. The average life expectancy was 30 years old. That's not true. If you made it past age 15, you'd live to your 60s, but that pulls the number down.
So Curtis Yarvin actually had this interesting idea or proposal, which he basically said, hey, instead of just giving people welfare, there's two ways to be in society. Either you're totally in Curtis's ideal society. You're either totally free, i.e., the government doesn't support you. You're a human, you're a free person. You succeed or fail on your own merits, or the government takes total control of you. And when example of something with total control, there's this restaurant in San Francisco called Delancey Street, and it's run by ex-convicts. So you get out of jail, and then you get a job working at Delancey Street. Except you don't only get a job there; you also live there. It's almost like the military; they take care of everything for you, and you are like you're responsible to them. So his basic recommendation is either you're a free person in society, or it should be like you work in the military or Delancey Street, which is, it's not just you get a handout, but you also get this inbuilt kind of community and almost religion, but you're not like as free as you would be normally. You know what I mean? So it's not like no strings attached money. It's like you have to work for it.
I think that's accurate because Hayek talks about that same concept where the second you move to the government being involved in the economy, over a century, it'll evolve into the buddies of the government are the ones who get they're the ones who get the money. And so you end up in this gradual serf society.
Yeah. Yeah.
So let me go through the book recommendations.
Sure, please, we're up.
I got to add the ones for China, but I'll put that at the end of when I release the China video on my channel. I'll put my book recommendations for China there. You can't go wrong with Will Durant. This Age of Faith. It's really long, but it's I keep going back to it. This was a book I read in college. It was surprisingly like the best book in this topic. A Short History of the Middle Ages by Rosenwein. The Time Traveler's Guide to Medieval England by Ian Mortimer. This is a really good book on the society of that time period. I referenced A Secular Age by Charles Taylor a lot, and I referenced Reynolds' Europe Emerges a bunch of times. This book was fine. Like it gave me a lot of info. So those are my medieval history recommendations.
Cool. And you want to give people some preview of what topics we'll cover next? You mentioned Golden Age of Islam.
Yeah, the foundation of Islam in the Golden Age.
Cool. Sounds great. Well, okay. Always a pleasure. And until next week.
See you next time. Peace.